Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Raw Podcast Playoff Semi-Final edition. I'm joined by my colleagues James Copley and Jason Jones. We're going to dissect Sunderland's remarkable, stressful, agonising, incredible win over Coventry City in great detail, I think. And we're also going to look ahead to the playoff final at Wembley next weekend. I'm going to get the negative out of the way. 9 days away from a playoff final, two sets of fans who have to make a long journey. 11:09 at time of recording, and we still don't have a kick-off time. Exorbitant ticket prices. It's an absolute scandal, and everyone involved should hang their heads in shame, really. But we'll try and focus on the positives of the Coventry game. Boys, how are we feeling? I've been a bit flat this morning because I've had that feeling of, oh God, what if it's never this good again? What if it is never as good as Dan Ballard thumping in a header off the underside of the bar in the 122nd minute?
I'm absolutely exhausted emotionally, to be honest, but I think I've sort of spun it the other way, and it's been a complete and utter privilege to witness that moment at the Stadium of Light. It is, for me, the best moment I've ever witnessed at the Stadium of Light, the loudest I've ever heard the Stadium of Light. I still can't believe it. I've watched the goal back 100,000 times from all angles, and it just gets better and better. The way he folds himself in half to head the ball into the back of the net, like his head's by his shins. It's like, I imagine that's what like Charlie Hurley used to be like, that you hear the stories and the tales of Charlie Hurley coming up the Roker Park pitch to score a header, and that's what you envisage. And the ball in from Enzo Lefebvre is absolutely sensational. And when it hits the back of the net, there is literally 1 second remaining on the added time on the clock. It's the most incredible sequence I think I've ever witnessed, and I'm just privileged and humbled that I was there, and I think it's going to live long in the memory. And I actually take the view of whatever happens in the playoff final now against Sheffield United, although I would love to win it and go to the Premier League. Like, we'll always have that moment. And I think it was really unifying between the fans, the players, the ownership. The whole day was just absolutely fantastic. I'm sure we'll come on to the atmosphere, but the fan groups working with the clubs and the bus coming into the stadium, it was just incredible. And what an advertisement for the club, for the city. Any player that looks at that is going to be massively impressed. It was fantastic, and yeah, I am just about emotionally done now. I think
it probably has to go at the top of the best stadium like moments, Jason, just because of the circumstances of being the last second. I think you could make a strong argument for Defoe against Chelsea, Defoe against Newcastle. Certainly, Kieran Richardson's free kicks one, that how the context of that game and how long it had been since someone won at home in the derby and all that. But I think the fact that, as James mentioned, when Dan Ballard stoops to get his forehead on that corner, there's 1 second left of the game, and let's be honest, it wasn't as if Sunderland had been battering the door down for 120 minutes and we were just waiting for the goal to go in. It was. What do you think? Best stadium like moment?
I think it's got to be, hasn't it? It's got to be. It's Hollywood stuff. It's fairy tale stuff. It's storybook stuff, and it was. I think it's the worst state to be in on a podcast, but it left me speechless, and I'm still a little bit speechless at this moment in time. I am emotionally drained in the absolute best way. I echo what James is saying, in the sense that, like, I don't know what's going to happen at Wembley. I hope to God we go up, but if we don't, we will always have that moment. And by the way, it couldn't have happened to a better candidate either. Dan Ballard, over the course of those two semi-final legs, was absolutely monstrous, just a monumental presence at the back. Such a wonderful job. And it was just, I've been watching football for, I'm 30 this year. I've been watching football for a quarter of a century. I don't think I've ever witnessed anything like that. I'm not entirely sure that I'm ever going to witness anything like that again. But like James says, what a privilege to have witnessed it, and the reaction, stadium, like, obviously the celebrations were absolutely wild, but just the unified outpouring of absolute jubilation. I just don't think I've ever felt anything like it. It was so special. I mean, obviously you two were up in the press box. I was off on Tuesday night, so I was in the stands for it, and it was just chaos. It was absolute chaos. There were bodies flying. I left the ground, and I go to a lot of like punk shows. Like I listen to a lot of punk music. My ears were ringing as if I'd been to a hardcore punk show. It was ridiculous. Like it just left me absolutely stupefied. And like I say, it was just such a wonderful, wonderful thing to witness and to be a part of, because it really did feel as if everybody in that stadium on Tuesday night was a part of a moment in history.
And I think that's why you've got to remember it as well, because you dream of stuff like that in football, but it never happens. Stuff like that never happens. And that's why I think, regardless of the result against Sheffield United, we'll always have that moment now. You know, that even the opposition it came against as well, with that little bit of needle and rivalry and the way the games had gone as well, it was incredible.
Shameless from Jason, by the way, to remind everyone he hasn't turned 30 yet. Don't think I am going to let that go unnoticed. Shocking. Absolutely shocking.
Or bragging that he got to spend the time in the stands, which I really would have liked to have done specifically for that game.
It's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the two legs in a bit more detail. There's been a lot of sort of discourse around the two legs, and a lot of sort of suggestions that Coventry were clearly the better team and Sunderland, sort of looked away a little bit. I'm interested to get you boys' opinion on this, because obviously I thought Frank Lampard gave a really dignified press conference when he came in and spoke after the second leg, and spoke about how proud he was of his players and how well they'd done in a difficult atmosphere to control the ball. And I understood all that. I thought that was absolutely right. I thought Coventry were excellent. But I'm surprised by the suggestion that Sunderland looked their way through, because Sunderland weren't great the other night, but they got through because of a tactical masterclass in the first leg. And I thought that Coventry were frozen, really, by not being prepared for what Sunderland did, how they approached the game. It should have been 3-1. Let's remember Eliza Mender ran through on goal later on. And I thought, you mentioned Dan Ballard there, the last sort of 10, 15 minutes of that first leg, long throw after long throw after long throw, even though Dan Ballard had come in the team to counter that and had been doing it all game. So just interested, I'll start with you, Jason, in terms of what you think, because while I think Frank Lampard is incredibly entitled to come in and say how proud he is of his players, I think that this discourse around the ties sort of ignores the fact that Sunderland really, and specifically Régis Lebris, really did a number on Coventry in that first leg.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think at the CBS Arena, it was evident. Look, we watch Sunderland every week this year, sometimes twice a week. And we know that Lebris has that in him. He's not afraid of sort of relinquishing possession, of sitting deep and of hitting teams on the break. It's been really effective for Sunderland on so many occasions this season. And I think what we have seen, and it's been a little bit of a pattern over the course of the campaign, is that sometimes opposition sort of misconstrue possession for dominance. I think sometimes teams think that because they've had so much of the ball, without necessarily laying too much of a glove on Sunderland, they've, absolutely schooled Sunderland. That's not necessarily the case. If Lebris is happy for his side to sit off and to hit teams quickly and effectively with the pace of an Isadora, Mayenda, or whoever it might be, and so be it. There's more than one way of winning a football match. You don't have to pass teams into submission and score unbelievably aesthetically pleasing goals all of the time, although it has to be said that I thought both of Sunderland's goals, for different reasons in the first leg, were really pleasing on the eye. I think in the second leg, Sunderland were almost to an extent a victim of their own success in the Midlands, because I think that what it meant was that they entered that second leg not entirely sure about the best way of approaching it. Were they going to sit back as deep as they did the CBS? Did they feel they need to go out on the front foot? And I think sometimes we perhaps saw them getting caught a little bit in the gap in between and not really knowing how to approach the game. You're absolutely right. It wasn't the best performance that we've ever seen from Sunderland on Tuesday night, but at the same time, they hung in there. They gave themselves an opportunity to still be in the contest come extra time. And then ultimately, when that one opportunity presented itself, they took it. And I think it's really, really hard. And look, we say this with an incredible amount of bias. We're all Sunderland fans. We write about Sunderland on a daily basis, but it's incredibly hard to begrudge Sunderland their place in the playoff final, in my opinion, given the way that they equipped themselves over the course of those two matches.
I think that's the big point, isn't it? Ultimately, home advantage in the second leg told. And that was Sunderland's reward for finishing, let's get it right, a large number of points ahead of Coventry over the course of a 46-game season. But I mean, you spoke to Dan Neil after the game, James, and there was a huge shift. So I think Jason's alluded to it there, where there was clearly a little bit of confusion. It's not the quite word, but tension in Sunderland in terms of how they approached the game. The second half of extra time, there was a marked shift in how Sunderland approached the game. They were a lot more brave in possession, got a lot more players ahead of the ball. It was almost as if the situation where it looked like they might lose sort of freed them up a little bit. And I know you spoke to Dan Neil about how the players almost came together and sort of, it was a bit of a collective thing to say, come on, let's really have a go at this now. Let's play a little bit more like we maybe usually do.
I think so, and I think the substitutions, actually, I thought Lebris got the substitutions spot on. I thought Chris Rigg really injected something into the game, obviously had a massive point to prove. Romain Mundell as well coming on, adding a bit of pace and directness, and Sunderland did improve in that extra time period. I think, for me, the discourse around this game in the two legs, it strikes me as sour grapes, really, from some quarters. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Sunderland didn't do anything beyond the rules of the game. And this isn't news to anybody, really. Anybody who's watched Sunderland knows that they'll surrender the ball for large parts of the game. And it wasn't a problem when Sunderland had the best start to a season in 90 years and the media was absolutely loving them at the beginning of the season. Sunderland have played this way for quite some time. Perhaps maybe it's not as extreme as the first leg at the CBS Arena, but they were also coming into that game on a big losing streak, trying to play themselves back into form. So I don't think anybody expected Sunderland to go out and really try and press Coventry on the front foot at their ground in the first leg of a playoff semi-final. That would have been stupid and suicidal. So I'm not really sure what some of these pundits and some of the people in the local media and Coventry, some Coventry fans, were really expecting, because to do what they think Sunderland should have done wouldn't have made much sense in my eyes. And I think Lebris, over the two legs, got it spot on. Yes, Sunderland rode the luck at times. You do need a little bit of luck in a playoff semi-final. But here we are, and I think Lebris has been vindicated and justified in his decisions.
Also, Coventry played a lot of long balls over the course of these two legs. I'm really surprised by some of the narrative that's come out by the game, because, as I say, in that first leg, Coventry were incredibly direct, and unfortunately, they blew it in that first leg because Dan Ballard came back into the team and he repelled that threat. So I'm a little bit surprised by some of the narratives. As I say, I thought Frank Lampard's post-match press conference was really excellent and dignified. But I am a little bit surprised by some of the suggestions that Sunderland have just sort of Inter Milan 2010 this. I think I don't really see that.
But even if they had, there'd be nothing wrong with that either. There would be absolutely nothing wrong with that.
I'm also old enough to remember when a certain Chelsea legend won a Champions League final where they had about 4% possession. So anyway, but that's by the by. But I think where it's an interesting discussion from a Sunderland perspective is throwing this forward. So we've seen literally over the course of two legs, two very different Sunderlands. The 4-4-2, low block, counter-attacking, pace of Meander and Isidore. And we've seen at the end of that Coventry game something a little more familiar, 4-3-3, two number 8s, popping it around a little bit. Dan Neil dropping in as the third centre-half, spreading the play. Both have looked brilliant at times this season. Both have looked not very good at times this season. And it raises the really interesting question of what you do when you play Sheffield United at Wembley in 9 days' time. So where are we at, boys, on sort of where we think Sunderland will go and what they should be doing going into this final?
I think it's a fascinating debate, and I don't have the answer, to be honest, because casting my mind back to, was it New Year's Day when we beat Sheffield United at home 2-1? That was the first time Lebris really sprung the 4-4-2, wasn't it, with Isidore and Meander up front. They both looked electric, and Sunderland got a win. At the time, we thought it was a win that might propel Sunderland into the automatic promotion spots, and they could really attack that. It didn't transpire that way, but I wonder if Lebris will have that in his mind. It's a cliche, isn't it? But that Wembley pitch is big and you don't want to be too open, particularly in the early stages of the game. Sheffield United have got an embarrassment of riches, really, for a championship club, although Sunderland shouldn't fear that, but they have got sort of deep pockets in terms of their bench and players that could come on and change the game. So I think it's a very interesting debate question. Would I start 4-4-2 at Wembley? Probably not, but I could see why you might be minded to do that. I just think in a big game like that against good opposition, you might want a little bit more control in the middle, and then you perhaps assess on how the game goes later on.
Romain Mundle's the big piece of this puzzle, isn't he, Jason, in terms of how fit he is? Because James alluded to it earlier in the podcast, he was the game changer, really, to a large extent. Chris Rigg, I would definitely put in that category as well, whose substitute efforts over the 2 legs were brilliant, really, given the disappointment that he'll have had at not starting. But Mundle's presence changed the game. It pushed Milan Van Eyck back. If he's fit, he has to start, doesn't he? Then that means that Enzo Lefebvre is moving into the middle, and the whole complexion of the team changes, doesn't it? Have we lost Jason there?
I think we may have lost him. He's still there. I don't know if he's slightly behind because he's nodding to all of your points, but you've stopped speaking, so.
Okay, we'll wait for Jason to re-emerge. James, are you starting Mundle if he's fit?
If he's fit, absolutely. I think he offers a lot, doesn't he, on that left-hand side? Not to say that Enzo Lefebvre's been he's
back. I think you've hit the nail on the head there.
This is strange, isn't it?
We've sort of said it all season, even during his long periods of absence. Sunderland are pretty undoubtedly a better side with Romain Mundle.
Are you back, Jace, or not? This is going well. Okay, he's dropped out.
Okay, so Jace was telling everyone that he would start Romain Mundle. James, you pick up from there.
Yes, I agree. To be honest, I think if he's fit, he's got to play. I think he's direct. I think he's an attacking threat. I think his goals and assists this season, when you consider how much he's actually played, is pretty remarkable, really. He's on my team sheet 100%, and I think, as you mentioned, Enzo Lefebvre in the middle is a really, really interesting prospect. I know one of them was a set piece, but over the course of the 2 legs, he's got 2 assists, hasn't he? You're just starting to see how influential he can be. I'm dying to see him in the middle. We haven't seen Mundle and Lefebvre really play in the same team, have we? Apart from that semi-final second leg. So I think we're all clamouring to see it. I do think that makes Sunderland's strongest team, and I feel a bit sorry for Chris Rigg because he's had an influence over the entirety of Sunderland's campaign so far. But yeah, I think if Mundle's fit, I think he's got to play, and I think most Sunderland fans would likely agree.
I think it's that thing, isn't it, of the risk in it, as you've just alluded to there, is that Mundle and Lefebvre never really played together, and it feels like a big risk to put new partnerships into your team, so close to such a big game. But having said that, there's a block of training, really, isn't there, James, that you should feel like there's enough preparation. If Lebris feels like that's his best team, there should be time to work on that. And as you say, it's tough on Chris Rigg, but the luxury of having him and one of those 2 strikers to come off the bench could be a massive boost.
Yeah, and it's the risk to reward ratio, isn't it? I think changing maybe a left winger out poses a little bit of a less of a risk, doesn't it? Really, obviously him and Serkin are pretty familiar with each other, Serkin and Mundle, so I think that works. And there's a fair amount of experience and sort of reliability and compatibility within that team that it's not really tearing the book up, is it, in a sense that Sunderland will maintain a shape that they're familiar with. So I don't see that as being too much of an issue. And I think Lefebvre is just born to play in the midfield, so I don't think that disrupts things too much either. Obviously, Dan Neil and Joe Bellingham are fairly familiar with each other by now, but it's definitely an interesting question. I think we've got Jace back, so maybe he can elaborate.
Yeah, we're just chatting about the balance of the side. I guess the strange thing about this final, Jason, is that we have this understanding that we know Sunderland can beat anyone on their day, including Sheffield United, because they've already done it. But there is this reality. I was watching the first leg of Sheffield United against Bristol City, and actually Bristol City did pretty well after the red card until I think it was 65 minutes, and Chris Wilder brings on Callum O'Hare and Tom Davies. And in those moments, you kind of realise what the difference is with these teams who have those parachute payments and the depth of their squad. They're fantastically well organised, so I'm certainly not taking anything away from Sheffield United. They're clearly, especially defensively, very well coached. But there is this reality, isn't there, that you are going up against teams that, for financial reasons, just have bigger squads and they have a level of depth that might win on the day. It's just, there's that quite brutal financial reality about this game, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, sorry for dipping away there, lads. I was chatting about Romain Mundle with myself for about 5 minutes. I was on a great time. But no, you're absolutely right, Phil. It's the reason that we see it so often, isn't it? These teams come down, they employ the parachute payments, and look, I understand it's perhaps a little bit reductionist, and it maybe takes a little bit of credit away from the clubs who do come down, especially when you see what's happened to Luton Town this season, to solely sort of attribute it to the parachute payments. But more often than not, it is a factor. Sheffield United were in a position in January where they were obviously in that promotion race, and then they went out reinforced. And while it didn't necessarily, catapult them into the automatic places, it did ensure that they were there or thereabouts throughout the second half of the campaign. And it does mean that on paper they do have the strongest team in this sort of playoff contingent. Like, that being said, we're talking about Sunderland and the potential rotation options that Libris has, the decisions he's going to have to make, and how tricky that might be for him. Sunderland might be in a position where they get to Wembley, and depending on what team Libris decides to go with, he might have the likes of a Wilson Isidore to bring on off the bench. He might have a Chris Rigg to bring on off the bench. It's not as if Sunderland are necessarily strapped of options. And again, I think it comes back to that thing where, we all sort of had our doubts and expressed our doubts and were a little bit wary of the rotation because of the way that it disrupted some momentum heading into the playoffs. But ultimately, like we sort of said last time we did the pod, you'd have to say that it's been vindicated to a certain extent, because it does mean that Libris now has the potential to, sort of dip into the depths of his squad that he might not have been able to this time 2 or 3 months ago, and might not have been able to if he'd continue to sort of field his strongest 11 throughout that final run of what were ultimately dead rubbers, I think.
James, you alluded to a little bit at the start of the podcast, and I wanted to discuss it a little bit more now, and I'll come back to you for your thoughts in a couple of minutes, Jace. But you've alluded to it there at the start, James, that I'm really excited about this playoff final, because the last 2 playoff finals we've done, it's kind of felt like all or nothing. Sunderland have to get out of League One. Dear God, we can't have another season in League One. What the hell is going to happen? Now, there's obviously a reality that we all know that if Sunderland lose this game, they're going to lose some players. And sometimes it can be really difficult to rebuild, and there'll be a lot of uncertainty and anxiety going into next season. But fundamentally, this feels, I'm not going to say a free hit, because that's obviously a ridiculous comment to make, but it feels like Sunderland everyone, players, fans, can really embrace this weekend. It's the reward for a terrific season. And it doesn't quite feel like the stakes are the same as they were, for example, that Wycombe game, where, there was an anxiety that came from, oh God, what if we lose this? Obviously, it'll feel horrendous if we do lose this one. But do you get what I'm saying? Do you think? Do you think I'm right?
Yeah, you are right. And I think going back to the Charlton one as well, the anxiety around that game under Jack Ross, Sunderland had blown the top 2. They wanted to secure an immediate return to League One. You kind of suspected that we weren't really good enough. And then you had the whole hoo-ha about losing it in the last minute, and then you consigned to the 3rd tier again. That felt really horrible and not a lot of fun. I think the Wycombe one, going into the game, having been in League One for so long, that you were so desperate to get out of there, that it was relief. There was a lot of joy and there was a lot of happiness, but you went into that game not wanting to lose, because losing to Wycombe Wanderers, with all due respect to Wycombe Wanderers, for a club of the size of Sunderland, to then spend another season in League One, the stakes were really high, just for that ownership as well. You think of where Sunderland could be if Sunderland hadn't secured a return to the Championship. It would have really, really set this plan and this model back. But coming into the Sheffield United one, I think there's a gratitude that we're here. There's an excitement. There is an understanding that we are playing against a team with parachute payments. I don't think that necessarily makes it like 100% a free hit, but there's a lot less anxiety, isn't there, coming into the game? I think my main cause of anxiety, and again, this is sort of lessened, but would be what you mentioned, Phil, is that I'm really, really keen to keep this group of players together to see what they could do over a long period of time. And if they got promoted, I would be interested to see how the likes of Joe Bellingham, Chris Rigg, Dan Ballard, Dennis Serkin coped in the Premier League with some additions. And I would like to keep this team together. Dan Neil in there as well. If they don't go up, then it's a real possibility that Sunderland could lose some of those players, like Trey Hume as well, thrown into the mix. There will be significant interest. So I think that's a worry, but I think that's why really that I would like to see us promoted as well, so we can keep this team together. But not winning this game isn't terminal for Sunderland. It's a bump in the road, I would suggest, and I genuinely do think we'd be able to go again. But I suppose when we all get to Trafalgar Square and we get to Wembley and we get to the day of the game, then the anxiety and the nerves will really kick in, and perhaps then it becomes less of a free hit, as some people have described it as, because you want to win at the end of the day, and you get to Wembley and Sunderland have got every chance because they can beat Sheffield United. They've shown it.
Yeah, you mentioned your main anxiety there. My main anxiety is that when I asked Labrice if he brought Yelder on to take the penalty because he was really good in training,
that was incredible.
He said, "Well, he's not the worst," and
that was incredible.
Which was very funny, but hasn't necessarily calmed me at all ahead of next weekend. But yeah, Jason, where are you kind of at emotionally in terms of the stakes of this final? And I am looking forward to this one more than the last two. And the Wycombe one, I was quietly confident, I have to say, because of what Sunderland had done in that semi-final, because of the quality that we've discussed around Sheffield United. I can't feel that way coming into this final. I think Sunderland will rightly go off as outsiders, even though we know they can definitely do it. But where are you kind of at with this final and what it all means?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of what's being said. I think, firstly, sort of regarding Sunderland's status as sort of outsiders, I think you're absolutely right. I think Sheffield United are favourites. I think you'll struggle to find any pundit analyst who doesn't agree with that. At the same time, there is a little bit of me wonders if that benefits Sunderland just a bit. This young squad, this fearless squad. Given the form they had going into the Coventry semi-final, I think most people have pretty much written them off. They've shown time and time again that they are capable of rising to the occasion. I think some of the best performances we've seen this season have been against the quote-unquote biggest teams in the Championship. And I think they can. They've earned the right to go into this and play without fear. And just really enjoy it as an occasion and for what it is. And I think it's important to remember that the season we had last year, we finished 16th, under Michael Beale and then Mike Dodds in an interim, and then Labrice coming in. He was such an unknown entity, and there was so much uncertainty about how Sunderland would perform this season. And I know that was sort of pretty quickly dispelled given the sort of electric start they had with the campaign. But I think if you'd have asked any Sunderland fan before a ball was kicked if they would be happy with the playoff final, of course they would be. Of course they would be. It's so far exceeded those initial expectations, and I think that it's such a wonderful reward for everything that the squad has achieved this year. I completely echo what James is saying in terms of the biggest fear I have is that if we don't go up, how many of these players go? That being said, I think that there are two caveats to that. I think the first one is that for the most part, Sunderland are in strong positions in terms of contracts, in terms of having a little bit of sort of bargaining power with a lot of those players. I know there are obviously exceptions to that. Serban and Neil are on relatively short contracts, and that's something that they'll probably look to address. But the other thing I would say is that even if, Sunderland were to lose, hypothetically, a Joe Bellingham, the money that would come in for him, do I have the faith that this recruitment model, this ownership would invest that properly to sort of kick on to the next stage of what they're trying to achieve here? Then yeah, I think I do, because I think they've earned that faith, that they've shown time and time again that they can bring in the players and they can develop the talent and they can build a squad, as we're seeing right now, capable of really challenging in the upper reaches of the Championship and ultimately trying to force its way back into the Premier League. So it's a game that, I think we will get to Friday, Saturday next week, and there will be a lot of trepidation and a lot of nerves. But at the same time, I think the overriding emotion has to be one of excitement. And it's just really well deserved. The Sunderland team has done wonderful things this season, and they deserve their day at Wembley.
The one thing I think as well, James, in terms of that player sales debate that I think gets a little bit lost at the moment is that, there was a lot of discourse around the decision at the time, which was totally understandable, but people forget a little bit that Sunderland have already banked 10 million going into this window. So Jason's mentioned the contract situation, which obviously there's two exceptions in Dan Neil and Dennis Serkin, where Sunderland are definitely vulnerable. But obviously Sunderland are in a strong position in that. And financially, they've already brought in over £20 million worth of sales if you go back to Jack Clark. So I think that's part of the the biggest sense of calm we have this time around, right, is that we can see what the plan is, even if we disagree with it at times. I would still like someone to sign a third striker at some point in their bloody history, but we can kind of see what the plan is, and we, while we know that some players will go, we can see that it's not going to be the complete end of the journey if we do go and lose this game. As no reason why they can't win, but which obviously might happen.
No, I think you're correct, and I think some of those replacements you would hope would already be through the door. The likes of Milan Alexic, Harrison Jones as well has looked promising when he's played. So I would echo what Jason said. I do have a lot of faith in this recruitment team. I would actually love to see what they could do with a big chunk of money as well. I think that would be interesting. Like transfers wise, I just want us to get us promoted so we can sign Enzo Lefebvre. I think that would be absolutely lovely to see him in red and white again. I do think if they don't get promoted though, they do face a little bit of a conundrum and a problem in a sense that, yes, they're well protected by a couple of really good and well-negotiated contracts, but Sunderland have also been very good with the likes of Jack Clark and Ross Stewart in that they haven't stood in the way when they've needed to go on and potentially further the career. Now, there are a couple of players now within Sunderland's squad that now fall into that bracket, and that's the key balance you've got to strike, isn't it? The needs of the team and the fan base, and also keeping your word to players and your reputation within the game, avoiding sort of long standoffs and confrontations. So I'm intrigued to see what happens.
Yeah, it's been mentioned there, but Jason, one of my fears is that we're going to look back in a few years' time and say, remember that time we signed that Enzo Lefebvre and he was unbelievable and he stood on the left wing watching the ball fly over his head for 6 months. Then we never saw him again. But we chatted, James and I chatted briefly while you were talking to yourself there about Lefebvre, and big game player, right? I mean, those games must have been torture for him, standing on the wing, not really able to get involved, shuffling back to try and help Dennis Sirkin out. But the patience he showed to wait for his moments. Should probably really finish the podcast, but I just want to talk about Enzo Lefebvre a bit because the quality he showed in the very rare moments he actually had to demonstrate was something to behold. That's what big game players are all about.
Absolutely. I mean, I always want to talk about Enzo Lefebvre, so we don't have to end the podcast just yet. I think you're absolutely right. Just interesting little thing. So I got the Metro through the match on Tuesday, and there was a lad got on. He had the away shirt on. He had like the E Lefebvre on the back, the big 28, and that. And it was one of those I was looking at. I was like, in 20 years' time, how much is that going to go for on classic football shirts? It's just it feels like a like lightning strike that he's even at the club, doesn't it? But yeah. What I will say is that I think the way that he has applied himself in less than ideal circumstances has been nothing short of admirable. Obviously, you said hasn't really played in his preferred position at all. I think in total he's probably had about half an hour in the middle of the park, something like that, And regardless of that, there's never once been a point at which you've thought, oh, this player who cost Roma 20-odd million pounds last summer, this player who, is capable presumably of cutting it at the very top level of European football, just doesn't look bothered about being here. I think there were so many instances on Tuesday prior to him being sort of moved in the middle and Mundo coming on, where he was really shuttling up and down that left flank. We sort of mentioned it last night, James, but like you could argue that actually the more impressive part of his game prior to the assist for Ballard was in his defensive work. He didn't necessarily have too much opportunity to do that much on the front foot. But regardless of that, he still completely bought into what Lebris was asking of him, completely put in the effort and ultimately played, his part in a really hard-fought victory. And look, I'd love something to go. I'd love him to sign for us. And I think that it would be so fascinating to see what he could do given a run in the Premier League, especially with some of the talent that's around him who are only getting better and better with age. But even if worse comes to worse and it doesn't happen, I think that, like you've sort of alluded to there, we will always look back fondly on the Enzo Lefebvre stint at Sunderland, because even though it hasn't been necessarily what him or Lebris would have envisaged when he first came into the club, there's been some wonderful moments, and by and large he's been a really, really positive addition to the Sunderland side.
I think that's
Yeah,
a point worth noting, actually, Phil and Jace, is that Sunderland's wingers on the night, although in an attacking sense weren't very impressive, the work rate both of them got through. Patrick Roberts actually doing it with a calf injury as well. It's later emerged. I thought they were absolutely sensational, and just the amount of running they got through, their desire, and as well. Dan Ballard's obviously rightly taken the headlines over the two legs, but Luke O'Nien as well, towards the back end of the game, Sunderland were left 2v2, and you really, really feared the worst. Coventry were in Sunderland's box, and O'Nien produces an absolute worldie of a tackle to get the ball away. And I think that's one of those moments we might look back at a couple of years and think like, wow, that was decisive, given what Sunderland went on to do in the game, because it was a superb bit of defending. He could have easily got it wrong and given away a penalty, and Coventry had a man over as well. It was brilliant.
Well, I think this is what, if we take away the tactics stuff, which obviously at times over the course of the season has been super impressive, I think this is what Lebris has brought. He was so ruthless earlier in the season, wasn't he? Do you remember that day we turned up at Blackpool and sort of half the squad had disappeared? But he was so ruthless in establishing what players he wanted to work with, and that wasn't necessarily about tactics or playing style. That was about the mentality, really, wasn't it? He's talked about this a lot over the course of the season, and you mentioned there the two wingers producing very selfless performances, and I know at times there's been discourse over the course of the season about goal contributions, and that's the reason why they're in the team, right? That's the reason why they're here. And yeah, I just want to pick up on that, Jace, because I do think sometimes we obsess about tactics and game plans and stuff like that, but probably what Lebris has done so brilliantly is not being worried about upsetting anyone. He is focused single-mindedly on getting a group of players who were together and shared that sort of ambition, if you like, and that's where the performances of the last two legs come through, right? Is building a squad that has the mentality and the togetherness to cope with that kind of pressurized situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, before he came in, what Sunderland really needed more than anything else was a clean slate and a breath of fresh air. The way that things ended last season, the mood around the club, it's just so negative. There was a real feeling of sort of deflation. And he's brought that clean break, hasn't he? And everything that's come after his appointment, obviously there have been tricky times this season, but it's a championship campaign. It's going to happen. And for the most part, everything that he's brought in with him has been hopeful and progressive. And it's really sort of re-established perhaps some of the connection, which was starting to dwindle a little bit in the latter stages of last season. Like you said, he made some tough decisions. I think you look at someone like Pierre Ekwa, who was such an instrumental part of Sunderland's side for such a long period over the course of the first two seasons in the championship, and he made that decision to send him out on loan. And while at the time there were certainly people who would have disagreed with that, I think it's hard to argue against it again being vindicated, because it's not necessarily as if Sunderland have missed Ekwa, as an example, too much over the course of the campaign. And you talk about the togetherness and the unity. I think you only need to look at the celebrations at full time on Tuesday. This is a squad who, first of all, are evidently willing to run through brick walls for the head coach, but are also just massively, massively united in trying to get this club back to the Premier League. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to see. And again, it's a wonderful thing to feel as if, as supporters, we're some small part of.
Yeah, I think that sums it up. I think that's why we can go to Wembley feeling pretty confident, even if we accept all the realities about some of the advantages that Sheffield United have and the quality they've had. Well, I think that just about covers it. Thank you everyone who's listened. And yeah, there's going to be stacks of content. We will probably be back for a preview of the actual final itself in a bit more detail at some stage next week. But there's going to be so much content on the Sunderland Echo website, on our YouTube page. So just stick with us, stay tuned. We'll be back with you very soon as the nerves start to grow and maybe the excitement as well. Cheers, boys, for your company and your chat. And we'll see you all very soon.